The winter had settled over the remote woods like a heavy, suffocating blanket, blanketing the trees, rocks, and forest floor in pure, crystalline white. Each gust of wind sliced through the air like a blade, making even the simplest movement outside a test of endurance. The man had lived in his secluded cabin for many years, accustomed to the quiet and isolation that the dense forest demanded. He had built his life around solitude, finding comfort in the rhythms of his own existence and the gentle, predictable routine that came with living off the land. Yet on that particular evening, as twilight surrendered to the icy grip of night, he was about to experience something that would shake the very foundation of his understanding of the wilderness around him. As he sat by the flickering fire, savoring the last warmth of the day, a subtle, almost imperceptible noise reached his ears. It was a soft, tentative scratching sound, accompanied by a faint, shivering whimper that seemed to carry a strange, pleading quality. At first he dismissed it, telling himself it was probably the wind rattling a loose board or the scurrying of a small animal in the underbrush. But the noise persisted, growing slightly more insistent, and then he noticed something moving just beyond the frosted glass of his cabin window. Squinting through the icy condensation, he saw two forms, shapes so large and familiar that his pulse quickened immediately. Wolves. These were not ordinary wolves, or at least not in the way he had imagined wild predators. They were coated in thick, snowy fur, which in some places was matted and clumped with ice. Their eyes glimmered like dark amber lanterns, reflecting the firelight from within the cabin in a way that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. They were pawing at the door, but there was no aggression in their movements. There was no growl or bared teeth, no snarling that demanded retreat or fight. Instead, their actions carried an almost human-like desperation, a silent plea that tugged at something deep within the man's heart. At first, disbelief and fear surged through him. Wolves were dangerous, and even in desperate times, they were not known for begging. The forest had taught him many lessons over the years about survival and the thin line between life and death in the wilderness. To open his door to them could mean a quick and brutal end, he reasoned. Yet, as he observed them more closely, he noticed the shivering, the trembling that ran through their bodies, and the way their heads dipped low in a gesture that seemed more like submission than threat. Their eyes were wide, almost pleading, and he felt a strange sense of recognition, as if these creatures understood something fundamental about need and vulnerability that transcended the natural order of predator and human. The man rose from his chair cautiously, each step creaking on the wooden floorboards of his cabin. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His instincts screamed that this was dangerous, that the wilderness outside was not a place for compassion when survival hung in the balance. Yet something deeper stirred within him, an empathy he had long buried under years of solitude and self-reliance. It was a tugging in his chest, a silent whisper urging him to act, to do something that went beyond fear and logic. He approached the door slowly, every fiber of his being alert to any sudden movement. The wolves' ears twitched as he drew near, and their eyes locked with his in a moment that felt suspended in time. He opened the door just a crack, peering outside into the bitter cold. The air hit him like a physical force, carrying the scent of snow, pine, and the faint musk of the wolves' fur. They did not leap or lunge. Instead, they inched closer, each paw carefully placed, each movement deliberate. One of them limped slightly, a subtle injury that hinted at a longer struggle for survival. The other bore an old scar across its muzzle, a silent testament to battles fought and endured. The man's heart ached at the sight. Here were creatures who were supposed to embody fearsome wilderness power, yet they were at his mercy, fragile and pleading in a way that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with their nature. He hesitated for what felt like an eternity. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the doorframe and stirring the snow into small, blinding drifts. The wolves' breaths formed delicate clouds in the air, each exhalation trembling with cold and fatigue. Finally, he made a choice, a leap of faith driven not by rational thought, but by a deep, primal understanding that sometimes compassion was the truest survival instinct of all. He opened the door wider, allowing them the threshold, and watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension as they stepped inside. Their paws sank into the wooden floorboards, leaving wet prints that glistened in the firelight, and they paused to take in the warmth that enveloped them for the first time in what must have been countless hours or even days of bitter exposure. The wolves' eyes darted around the cabin, scanning the space for signs of danger. The man remained perfectly still, aware that any sudden movement might trigger fear or aggression. Slowly, the creatures began to relax, the rigid tension in their bodies easing just enough for them to approach the fire and rest near it. He could see the subtle rise and fall of their chests as they struggled to catch their breath, the way their ears flicked in unison at the crackle of the flames. It was a moment of profound connection, an unspoken understanding that in this cabin, in this small haven carved from the wilderness, danger could give way to trust. The man felt a strange mixture of exhalation and humility. He realized that this encounter was unlike anything he had experienced before. The wolves were not simply animals to be feared or admired from a distance. They were living beings capable of expressing need, of silently pleading for aid in a world that often left the weak behind. In that instant, he understood something fundamental about the delicate balance of life in the wilderness. Strength and vulnerability existed side by side, and compassion could bridge the divide between species in ways that no force or weapon ever could. As he stood there, watching them settle near the fire, he felt a warmth that went beyond the physical. It was the warmth of connection, of shared survival, of recognizing the life in another being and choosing to honor it. The wind continued to howl around the cabin. The night remained cold and unforgiving, but within the cabin there was a fragile sanctuary. In the wolves' pleading eyes, he saw the raw truth of life in the wild. Survival was not just about strength or cunning. It was also about trust, empathy, and the willingness to open one's door, literally and metaphorically, to those in need. The moment the man opened the cabin door wider, allowing the wolves to step inside, he felt a wave of both relief and apprehension wash over him. The cold gusts from outside mingled with the warmth of the fire, and for a brief instant the world seemed to hold its breath. The wolves hesitated at the threshold, their large paws leaving wet, dark prints on the wooden floorboards. Their eyes flicked nervously around the room, drinking in the unfamiliar sights and smells of the cabin. The scent of burning wood, dried herbs hanging from hooks, and the faint, lingering aroma of the man's meals from earlier in the day. Despite their natural wariness, there was a visible relief in their posture, a subtle easing of tension that told him they had recognized in some primal way that this place offered warmth and safety. He stood perfectly still, his heart pounding, acutely aware that any sudden movement could trigger a defensive reaction. One of the wolves, the one with the limp, gingerly took a step closer to the hearth. Its muscles were taut with uncertainty, but it did not growl or bare its teeth. The other wolf, scarred across its muzzle, followed a few cautious steps behind, keeping a careful distance while sniffing the air, trying to make sense of this new environment. Their breaths came in visible puffs, shaky from exhaustion and cold, and the man realized that for all their natural strength and predatory skill, they were vulnerable in this state. The sight of these creatures, fierce in the wild, yet suddenly so fragile, stirred a deep protective instinct within him. Carefully, he lowered himself to the floor, keeping his body low and non-threatening, and extended his hand slightly toward the nearer wolf. He didn't speak. He knew any sudden sound might startle them, but he offered a small gesture of calm reassurance. The wolf paused, tilting its head, studying him with cautious curiosity. It was a moment of silent negotiation, a subtle communication between human and wild creature that transcended words. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wolf stepped closer, sniffing the man's hand with tentative curiosity before retreating slightly to gauge the other wolf's response. The scarred wolf mirrored the action, inching closer as if emboldened by its companion's cautious courage. The man felt a profound connection forming, fragile yet undeniable, as if trust was being built step by step on the floorboards of his small, isolated cabin. Realizing that the wolves were not going to attack, he moved to the kitchen area, opening the small freezer and retrieving a slab of raw meat he had set aside for his own meals. He returned to the fire, crouched down, and placed the meat gently on the floor. The wolves' eyes widened with interest, but still they did not move too quickly. They were hungry, that much was clear, but there was a wariness born from countless encounters with humans and survival instincts honed in the wild. The man sat quietly, his breath calm and even, allowing them to approach at their own pace. After a long, tense moment, the limping wolf crept forward and began to eat, followed cautiously by its scarred companion. The man's heart lifted as he watched them consume the food, understanding that this small act of generosity had bridged a gap between fear and trust. With the immediate need for sustenance met, the wolves began to explore the cabin in a more deliberate manner. They sniffed the edges of furniture, pawed gently at rugs, and circled the fire, as if trying to map out this strange new territory. Their movements were careful but deliberate, revealing intelligence and curiosity far beyond what one might expect from creatures usually defined only by their predatory nature. The man observed each step, noting the subtle signals of comfort and stress, the easing of their ears, the softening of their eyes, the occasional low grumble of contentment when they settled near the warmth of the fire. It was a delicate dance of mutual observation and adaptation, and he felt honored to be included in it, even as an outsider in their wild world. The man recognized that the wolves were exhausted from more than just the cold. Their bodies bore the marks of a harsh winter and the constant struggle to survive.
The limping wolf had a swollen paw, likely injured while hunting or navigating the icy terrain, and the scarred wolf's muzzle told a story of past conflicts. The man carefully assessed their condition, aware that without his intervention they might not have survived another night. He fetched a thick blanket and draped it across a low bench near the fire, creating a makeshift bed. The wolves approached cautiously, sniffing and circling the blanket before settling down on it, curling their bodies tightly for warmth. The sight of them finally resting, their eyes half closed, filled the man with a quiet sense of accomplishment and relief. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The wolves began to grow more comfortable, their initial wariness slowly giving way to tentative trust. They shifted closer to the fire, letting the heat seep into their bones, and occasionally looked up at the man as if checking that their safety remained intact. He spoke softly to them, recounting mundane details of his day and observations about the weather, his voice a steady and calming presence in the silent cabin. It was remarkable how responsive they seemed to his tone and rhythm, attuning themselves to the cadence of human speech without understanding the words themselves. The man marveled at the subtle interplay of instincts, experience, and intuition that defined this moment, a human and two wild animals coexisting briefly and peacefully in a world usually defined by survival of the fittest. In the quiet of the cabin, the man reflected on the broader implications of this encounter. These wolves, symbols of untamed wilderness, had sought refuge in his home, guided by instinct and desperation. Their actions challenged his preconceived notions about the boundary between human and animal, wild and domestic, danger and trust. In opening his door, he had risked much, yet gained something profound, a glimpse into the vulnerability of creatures often considered fierce and untouchable, and the powerful effect of compassion, even in the harshest conditions. He realized that trust was not given lightly in nature, and the fact that they had chosen to step into his space, albeit hesitantly, was a testament to the deep, silent bonds that could exist between species. As dawn approached, the first rays of light filtering through frosted windows, the wolves remained at peace, their bodies relaxed, their breathing steady. The man had kept his vigil through the night, watching over them, offering warmth, food, and safety. In return, the wolves had offered something rare and invaluable, trust, a fleeting but profound acknowledgement of human kindness. The experience left an indelible mark on the man's soul, a reminder of the fragile beauty that could emerge when fear was set aside and empathy guided action. He understood that this night would remain with him forever, a story of survival, connection, and the quiet miracles that could occur when one chose to open their door, not just physically, but emotionally.
The moment the wolves stepped fully inside the cabin, the man could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The door had closed behind them, sealing out the bitter, icy wind that had threatened to bite through his clothing just moments before. Now the warmth of the fire filled the room, creating a small sanctuary against the harsh winter night. The wolves paused, their large fur-covered bodies stiff with caution, scanning the unfamiliar interior with keen amber eyes. Every shadow seemed alive to them, every creaking floorboard a potential threat. Yet, despite the tension in their muscles, there was no aggression. They were not predators in pursuit of prey here. They were weary travelers seeking refuge, and their caution spoke of fear mingled with curiosity rather than hostility.
The man remained seated on the floor, cross-legged near the hearth, careful not to make sudden movements that could startle them. He watched as the limping wolf took tentative steps forward, each paw pressed lightly onto the cold wooden floor, leaving small wet prints that glistened in the firelight. Its eyes darted from corner to corner, ears flicking nervously at each new sound, the crackle of the fire, the whistle of wind through a loose board, the faint creak of the cabin settling in the cold. It was clear that the wolf's instincts were still in overdrive, honed by countless nights in the wild where danger could appear without warning. Every nerve in its body was alert, every muscle poised for flight or fight, yet it held itself back, drawn toward warmth and safety in the room. The scarred wolf mirrored its companion, moving a few steps behind and circling warily as it sniffed the air. Its muzzle twitched with each inhalation, picking up scents both foreign and familiar. The smell of cooked meat lingering faintly from earlier meals, the faint woodiness of the cabin itself, the smoke from the fire, and most importantly, the scent of the man. There was a strange mixture of fear, caution, and faint recognition in its gaze, as though it could sense that the human before it had made a choice to protect rather than harm. The man spoke softly, barely above a whisper, describing the fire, the warmth, even the wind outside. Though the wolves could not understand the words, the tone carried calm assurance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in their bodies began to ease, a fraction at a time. The limping wolf crept closer to the fire, lowering its body as it approached, every movement deliberate. It paused occasionally, looking up at the man with those deep amber eyes, as if asking silently for permission to rest. The man simply nodded slightly, not taking his eyes off the wolves, but offering a gentle, reassuring presence. Finally, the wolf curled near the edge of the fire, tucking its legs beneath it and letting the heat seep into its chilled bones. Its breathing, once shallow and rapid from stress and cold, began to slow. The scarred wolf soon followed, circling the space carefully before settling on a small rug near the fire. Both animals lay with their bodies relaxed but alert, a delicate balance of comfort and readiness. They were learning that this strange, enclosed space was not a threat, and the man in turn was learning to read every flicker of muscle and glance of the eyes as subtle signals of trust being built. The wolves began to explore their surroundings with increasing confidence, albeit cautiously. Their noses led them across the floor, up to the small wooden table and along the edges of the furniture. Each new texture, each scent was catalogued with meticulous attention. The limping wolf sniffed at a stack of firewood, pawed at the rug with hesitant curiosity, and then returned to the fire to warm itself. The scarred wolf examined the kitchen counter, eyes flicking toward the man whenever it detected movement, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. This dance of exploration was deliberate and careful. They were learning, and the man was learning alongside them, observing their behaviors, gauging their comfort levels, understanding how the combination of instinct, fear, and curiosity governed every step they took. Despite their initial caution, the wolves began to exhibit small signs of relaxation. Their ears, once sharply angled and constantly scanning, began to soften. Their breathing, previously rapid and shallow, became slower, almost rhythmic. Every so often, the scarred wolf would shift slightly closer to its companion, a subtle gesture of reassurance and shared safety. They were beginning to trust not only the warmth of the fire, but also the man who had opened the door to them. The room, filled with soft shadows and flickering light, became a sanctuary, a temporary haven where the harsh rules of survival were momentarily suspended. The man carefully fetched a few blankets from a shelf and draped them on a small wooden bench. He motioned toward the makeshift bedding, inviting them to rest there if they wished. The limping wolf hesitated for a moment, sniffed the blankets, and then gingerly stepped onto the bench, curling tightly, nose tucked beneath its paws. The scarred wolf lingered near the fire for a bit longer, surveying the room, but eventually joined its companion on the rug, settling into a posture that suggested tentative trust. The cabin, once silent except for the crackle of the fire, was now filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of the wolves' breathing, a quiet, steady presence that brought a sense of peace to the man's own heart. Throughout the night, the wolves continued to oscillate between cautious exploration and periods of rest. They would rise periodically, moving slowly to inspect the window, sniff at the door, or circle the hearth, each movement deliberate and calculated. The man learned to anticipate these behaviors, speaking softly to maintain calm, offering small gestures like pushing a piece of meat closer or adjusting the blankets to improve their comfort. The wolves responded subtly, their amber eyes softening, their bodies relaxing incrementally. It was a delicate balance, an unspoken negotiation between human and wild animal, each respecting the boundaries of the other while learning to coexist in this shared space. As hours passed, the wolves' initial fear gradually gave way to curiosity and tentative comfort. The limping wolf stretched slightly, yawning in a display of growing ease. The scarred wolf shifted its position closer to the fire, resting its head on its paws while occasionally glancing at the man. Their trust was not complete, but it was developing, built on the careful, consistent actions of the man who had offered warmth, safety, and food without judgment or expectation. The night wore on, and in the flickering glow of the firelight, a profound lesson became clear. Even the wildest, most cautious creatures could learn to trust when met with patience, empathy, and respect. By the time the first hints of dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows, the wolves were resting more deeply, their bodies relaxed, yet still alert enough to respond if necessary. The man sat quietly near the hearth, reflecting on the night's events. He had witnessed something extraordinary. Two wild animals, once terrified and exhausted, finding shelter and warmth in a human home. He realized that this was more than a simple act of survival. It was a rare, intimate glimpse into the intelligence, sensitivity, and emotional depth of creatures often misunderstood as mere predators. In that small, snowbound cabin, trust had been forged, and a fragile, extraordinary bond had begun to root.
The man watched the wolves as they slowly settled near the fire, their bodies curling tightly to conserve heat, their amber eyes still alert and cautious. Despite the cabin's warmth, it was evident that these animals were exhausted, their survival in the brutal winter having left its mark on both their bodies and spirits. The limping wolf shifted slightly, stretching a stiff leg before curling again, while the scarred wolf lifted its head to sniff the air, nostrils flaring, taking in the scents of the cabin, the food, and the man who had opened the door to them. The sight tugged at the man's heart. He knew that their hunger and fatigue were not merely temporary discomforts. They were the cumulative result of days, perhaps weeks, struggling to survive in conditions that were far harsher than anything he had ever experienced. He rose slowly, careful not to startle them, and walked to the small kitchen area.
He opened the freezer, revealing a slab of raw meat he had set aside for emergencies, the kind of thing he would normally use sparingly to preserve his own supplies. Tonight it would serve a higher purpose, nourishment for these two creatures who, despite their fierce appearance, had endured unimaginable hardship. The man's trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the profound weight of the responsibility he felt. He had opened the door and allowed them in, but feeding them, tending to their basic needs, was another level of commitment. It was a direct act of compassion, one that required patience, observation, and understanding of the delicate balance between generosity and caution. Returning to the hearth, he placed the meat on the floor at a safe distance. The wolves' eyes immediately locked onto it, and for a moment the cabin was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. The limping wolf cautiously approached the meat first, pausing halfway to glance up at the man. Its amber eyes seemed to ask a silent question. Is it safe? The man gave the faintest nod, not daring to make any sudden gestures. Slowly, the wolf lowered its head and began to eat, its movements careful, almost hesitant. The scarred wolf followed suit, keeping a watchful eye on both the food and the man, sniffing the air before bending down to take its first bites. The sound of chewing, soft but steady, filled the room, punctuated by the occasional crunch as frozen bits of meat yielded to their jaws. The man knelt quietly, observing their eating patterns and physical condition. The limping wolf ate slowly, favoring its injured leg, while the scarred wolf's movements were deliberate and measured. He noted the scars, the signs of past battles, the signs of hunger that had left their bodies lean and tense. Every detail mattered: the condition of their coats, the stiffness in their limbs, the wary glances they exchanged with him. He realized that feeding them was not just about satisfying hunger, it was about providing sustenance in a way that acknowledged their exhaustion and pain, allowing them to regain some measure of strength without feeling threatened. This understanding, though subtle, was crucial to building trust between human and animal. Once the wolves had eaten, the man fetched a bowl of fresh water from the sink. He set it down near the makeshift bedding and stepped back. The limping wolf approached first, lapping at the water carefully, its tongue brushing against the edge of the bowl. The scarred wolf followed, drinking with a similar caution, its ears flicking occasionally at the man's movements. This simple act, offering water, was profoundly symbolic. It was a recognition of their basic needs and a demonstration of care, an acknowledgement that even creatures so formidable in the wild could require assistance and compassion to endure the harshness of their environment. The man felt a deep sense of fulfillment, mixed with awe at the trust these wolves were beginning to place in him. With food and water addressed, the man turned his attention to the wolves' comfort. He grabbed the thick blankets he had draped on the bench earlier and rearranged them near the fire, creating a more substantial bedding area. The limping wolf sniffed the blankets cautiously before settling into them, curling tightly around its injured leg. The scarred wolf followed suit, circling once before resting beside its companion. The man noticed that as they settled, their breathing slowed further, a clear indicator that they were beginning to feel safe in this new environment. The act of providing a comfortable resting place was simple in execution, but profound in effect. It offered not only warmth, but also a sense of security, a foundation upon which trust could grow. He continued to observe them through the night, mindful of the fact that these were wild animals, not pets. The wolves would occasionally shift positions, stretch, or glance toward the door, but each time their movements were less tense, less driven by instinctive fear. The man spoke softly to them, recounting details of the fire, the wind outside, and the safety of the cabin. Though they could not understand his words, the tone conveyed calm and assurance, reinforcing the sense that this was a sanctuary rather than a trap. The subtle interplay between their instincts and his gentle guidance created an environment in which trust could flourish, where the wolves could begin to heal both physically and emotionally. As hours passed, the man realized that his role extended beyond simply feeding and providing water. He needed to monitor their condition, watching for signs of distress, fatigue, or worsening injury. He gently touched the limping wolf's leg, careful to gauge its reaction without causing alarm. The wolf flinched slightly, but did not withdraw, a small but meaningful sign of acceptance. He stroked the scarred wolf's head, noting the tension in his muscles ease under his careful hand. These gestures, small and deliberate, were a dialogue of reassurance, a non-verbal way of communicating that the cabin was a safe space and that the man's intentions were genuine. Throughout the night, the wolves alternated between resting and exploring, eating and drinking, always returning to the fire for warmth. The man remained attentive, ensuring their needs were met and that they had access to sustenance and comfort whenever necessary. He reflected on the extraordinary nature of this encounter. These were creatures of the wild, independent and wary, yet they had sought refuge in his home, placing a measure of trust in him that was rare and precious. Every act of feeding, every bowl of water, every rearranged blanket contributed to the creation of a fragile but profound bond. By dawn, the wolves were visibly more relaxed. Their breathing was steady, their postures less rigid, and their eyes softer, reflecting a growing sense of security. The man knew that this was only the beginning. They would need continued nourishment, care, and patience to fully recover from the harsh conditions outside. But the first steps had been taken. Through food, water, warmth, and gentle attention, he had provided not just sustenance, but a foundation of trust. In doing so, he had transformed a moment of desperation into one of hope, bridging the divide between human and wild animal with simple acts of care and understanding.
The wolves had been inside the cabin for only a few minutes, yet the change in their posture was remarkable. The once tense creatures, frozen and wary at the doorway, now cautiously ventured deeper into the warmth, their paws leaving damp trails on the wooden floor. The man watched them carefully, his heart pounding with both fear and compassion. He understood that wild wolves were not pets. They were apex predators, accustomed to relying on themselves for survival. But tonight they were vulnerable. Hunger and cold had driven them to his door, and now he faced a choice: retreat in fear or offer the help they so desperately needed. He chose the latter. The first step in tending to them was food. He moved quietly toward the small kitchen area, careful not to make sudden movements. Inside the freezer lay a slab of raw meat he had saved from earlier, a ration meant for emergencies, but now perfectly suited to this situation.
He could see the limping wolf eyeing him from the corner of the cabin, muscles tense, eyes wide with cautious curiosity. The scarred wolf stayed a few paces behind, watching both the man and its companion. Both creatures had been weakened by hunger and the bitter cold, and he knew that their survival depended on his careful handling of this situation. One wrong move could shatter the fragile trust forming between them. He placed the meat on the floor at a safe distance from himself and retreated slightly. The wolves hesitated, noses twitching, scanning the air, the fire, and the man's every movement. The limping wolf took a tentative step forward, sniffing the meat before retreating to glance back at him. The man nodded softly, offering reassurance without words, and the wolf moved closer, lowering its head to begin eating. The scarred wolf followed suit, circling cautiously before taking its first bites. The man observed each movement carefully, noting how they approached, how they sniffed, and how they gauged safety. This was not simply feeding, it was a delicate negotiation of trust and instinct. After they had eaten for minutes, he fetched a bowl of fresh water from the sink. He placed it near the makeshift bedding he had created earlier, stepping back to give them space. The limping wolf approached first, lapping at the water carefully, its tongue brushing the edge of the bowl. The scarred wolf followed, taking slower, more measured sips, ears flicking at every sound. The act of offering water was more than just meeting a basic need. It was a demonstration of care and understanding. He realized that these wolves had survived in an unforgiving wilderness for days or weeks without sufficient food or water, relying on instinct and raw endurance to get by. Tonight, he was offering more than survival. He was offering relief, a brief reprieve from the brutality of their environment. With their immediate needs met, the man turned his attention to their comfort. He retrieved the thick blankets he had prepared earlier and spread them near the fire, creating a warm, soft area for them to rest. The limping wolf approached cautiously, sniffing before curling up tightly on the blankets, tucking its injured leg beneath its body. The scarred wolf took a few more cautious steps, finally settling down beside its companion, body relaxed yet still alert. The man knelt nearby, careful to keep his presence non-threatening. Watching them begin to rest, he realized that feeding and providing water were only part of the care they required. They also needed warmth, safety, and reassurance that the cabin was a haven, not a trap. Throughout the night, he observed them closely. Every small movement, every shift in posture, every glance was significant. The wolves would rise occasionally, sniff the room, circle the fire, and then return to rest. Their breathing gradually slowed, a clear indicator of growing comfort and trust. The man spoke softly, recounting details of the fire, the wind outside, and the small safety of the cabin. While they could not understand his words, his tone conveyed calm and assurance, reinforcing the sense that this was a sanctuary. Through his careful observation and gentle presence, he was meeting their physical needs and beginning to nurture an emotional connection, a bond that, though fragile, was essential to their recovery. The man's attention was particularly drawn to the limping wolf. Its injured leg required careful observation. He noticed how the wolf favored it, shifting weight to compensate, moving with deliberate caution. Occasionally, he would extend a hand slowly to assess the leg's stiffness and swelling, careful not to provoke fear or pain. The wolf flinched slightly, yet did not retreat, a subtle signal of trust forming between them. These gestures were small but meaningful, a silent dialogue of reassurance and care, an unspoken promise that he was there to help, not harm. Meanwhile, the scarred wolf had its own story written in the lines of its face and the tension in its muscles. Its muzzle bore a long, healed scar, a remnant of past struggles. The man noticed how carefully it moved, how it paused at each sound, and how it scanned the cabin as if evaluating the safety of every corner. By offering food, water, and warmth, he was acknowledging its past hardships and providing a space to heal, both physically and emotionally. Each act of care built trust incrementally, teaching the wolves that they could relax even in the presence of a human, and that their needs would be met without threat or aggression. Hours passed, the fire crackling softly, the wind howling outside, and the wolves continued their careful exploration and rest. They shifted positions periodically, but each time returned to the blankets or near the fire. The man remained vigilant, ensuring they had continued access to food, water, and warmth. He realized that this was a long-term process. Surviving the brutal cold had left both wolves physically weakened and emotionally cautious. Their recovery would require ongoing attention, patience, and empathy, but the first steps had been taken. Through simple acts, feeding, providing water, and arranging bedding, the man had begun to restore their strength and trust, laying the groundwork for their eventual return to full health. By dawn, a visible change had occurred. The wolves were calmer, their breathing steadier, their bodies more relaxed. They still maintained a level of wariness, natural in wild animals, but the tension that had gripped them when entering the cabin had eased significantly. The man reflected on the extraordinary nature of the night. These were creatures of the wild, independent and wary, yet they had allowed him to feed, hydrate, and tend to them. In doing so, they had demonstrated a remarkable willingness to trust, a testament to the power of compassion and care. The man understood that feeding the wolves was more than a practical necessity. It was a symbolic gesture, a bridge between human and animal, wild and domestic, survival and empathy. By tending to their basic needs, he had affirmed their value, acknowledged their struggle, and provided a moment of respite in a world that had offered little mercy. It was a profound reminder of the impact that a single act of kindness could have, even on creatures as fierce and independent as wolves. As the morning light began to filter through the frosted windows, the man sat back, watching the wolves curl up near the fire, their eyes half closed in contentment. He knew that the night had been transformative for both him and the animals. Through food, water, and gentle attention, he had provided not just sustenance, but a foundation of trust and security. In doing so, he had turned a moment of desperation into one of hope, laying the groundwork for the wolves' recovery and the bond that would continue to grow in the days to come.